we're live. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to today's webinar, Building a Better Interview Process. I'm Josh Jones, and I'm joined by Dr. Fred Rafilson, Justin Hess, and Joshua Lange. And as you know, as I'm sure you've heard, we're facing waves of disruption within the TA space. There's just chaos everywhere. The news and the hits, they just keep on coming. And one of the most important things that we have to do as TA practitioners is to make sure that we're driving an effective and practical interview process. So today's webinar is going to be all about that. Today's content has been made possible by our friends over at Talview. And before we kick things off, I'd like to introduce a brief word from our sponsor.
Talview offers an end-to-end AI-powered hiring solution that simplifies and automates your hiring processes. Make better bias-free talent decisions with insights into several candidate attributes. Recruit talent of all abilities with a 100% mobile experience. Easily integrate your HR tools with Talview and rest assured that all your data is safe, secure, and private. From the testing center to the office to the home, discover a world of untapped talent.
And we're back. There is a chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A tab of that feature. Dr. Fred Rafilson is going to be our moderator for today. So I'm going to hand this over to him, and I'm going to turn off my video and my audio, but I'll be watching the chat pretty closely. So take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josh. And thanks for the little introduction about the disruption based, from the pandemic to the Great Resignation and the growing skills gap. And yes, TA really struggles to meet their hiring goals. But at the same time, the candidate interview is the most common component of virtually all hiring processes. And it continues to be a source of inconsistency, inefficiency, and unreliable data. Something that we as IO psychologists and TA leaders really struggle with and really want to solve. And I really believe that while most interviewers are well-intentioned, they find it hard to elicit information that is predictive or indicative of a candidate's likelihood of success on the job. It's tough to do an interview that really is predictive. Interviewers often fail to, I think, probe some of the most important topics, and they really lack an understanding of how to rate a candidate in a reliable and accurate manner. And I think the real reason is that most interviewers are just not trained in the skills required to set candidates at ease, portray the organization as a preferred place to work, talk about the importance of the position in question, talk about the importance of that candidate in that role to the overall success of the organization, and then, of course, elicit job-related information through relevant conversation, as opposed to what we've all seen, interrogation. So, and there's more to discuss, and we're gonna tap into it. But I think the lack of skill and training on the part of interviewers really does a couple of things. One, it increases the likelihood of losing good candidates, and in today's fast-paced market, that's a problem, right? We've got a good candidate on the line. We don't want to lose them. It also contributes to the lack of what we call validity or bad hires. So if we don't get good job-related information, our decisions are not great. The validity of the interview goes down. And of course, something we're all very concerned about, which is really simple human nature, and it's that unconscious bias related to a candidate's work history, appearance, demographic, that really can creep into competency ratings, the questions asked, and can further decrease the effectiveness of the interview, and of course, for an organization's DE&I goals. So with these challenges in mind, I'm really happy and fortunate to have a couple of amazing professionals here to talk about ways to make the interviewing process more effective and more informative. So rather than me giving you a bio and introduction, I'd really like you to hear from these guys themselves. Joshua and Justin, I leave it to you. Whoever's quickest can start, and if you could just give a quick intro, that'd be awesome.
Go ahead, Justin.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Hess. I lead talent assessment for Capital One. I have a little over 16 years in the industry. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist by trade, have my PhD, and I have really focused my entire career on selection and assessment. So I've done everything from consulting to leadership development, now to enterprise-wide talent assessment. Looking forward to speaking with you all today and looking forward to the conversations that we'll have. Josh, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So, it's a pleasure being here again. We did these a couple months ago, and it was a lot of fun. My background is 25 years in talent acquisition and recruiting. I've worked across all levels of organizations. I've worked across industries, so recruitment process outsourcing, RPO, now internal. I've had the opportunity to see, interview processes for companies like Whirlpool and Honeywell and Amazon and now the company I'm with, as well as several others. So it's definitely been an interesting ride in my career, and I'm certainly enjoying the organization I'm with now. But certainly happy to be here and talk about the things that I've seen and learned, and how we can hopefully make an impact where it makes the most sense as far as the interview process, and give you guys some tidbits of information that might help your journey along the way. So thank you all for joining.
Awesome. Humbling to be with you guys, and I think great for our audience to be able to learn from you and hear from your experiences and your perspectives. I feel silly, giving an intro in your presence, but I'm Fred Rafilson. I'm the Chief IO for Talview. I'm also an industrial and organizational psychologist. Been doing this for a lot of years. I'm not going to tell you how many years. I'm a testing guy. I love assessments. I'm all about validity, reliability, and fairness. Been developing and administering assessment processes my entire professional life. And of course, as I said, the interview is the most commonly used assessment. And I think people tend to forget that an interview is absolutely an assessment. So with that, I'd like to start. Thanks for the intros. Really appreciate it, guys. Look forward to this. And, as always, we've talked before, feel free to jump in. I've got some questions to sort of keep us going, but I'll get us started with the first one. And I guess it relates to my initial talk that, given the importance of the interview and talent acquisition, do you find, from your perspective, that ensuring that your interviews have the skills that they need to conduct an effective and a fair interview is a challenge?
Justin, you want to go?
Thanks, Josh. Fred, I actually want to anchor on a comment you just made that I feel like is very, very important to stress, that interviews are assessment tools. And if you think of most assessments out there, there is some sort of training, some sort of certification for the people who administer it, right? I feel like interviews, though, are often misunderstood and often left off of that kind of certification process. And so what you have is generally a stable of interviewers. Sometimes it depends on your company size. It could be maybe just a few of the most senior leaders if you're in a smaller stage startup. It could be hundreds, sometimes even thousands if you're in a much larger enterprise organization that may or may not get that requisite training. And it's also important to call out that there's different types of interviews. So you have job fits, you have behavioral interviews, you have more technical interviews, and each one requires a different type of training. Though I will say, I think there's some commonalities across all of them, like DIB or diversity, inclusion, and belonging training, bias training, so on and so forth, that kind of span across all of them. But I think sometimes as companies and as an industry, we forget that interviews are assessment tools too.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would absolutely echo that. And I think in some organizations, it's just take it for granted. It's just a general conversation. Where I think to go back to Fred's original question, no, I don't think there is enough broad interview training across organizations, from small organizations to organizations with hundreds of thousands of people. It is an art and it is a skill and it does need to be taught. It is a conversation, but it needs to be structured in such a way that you elicit the information that you need to ascertain whether this person is a good fit for the role, whether they can, got the right skills, the right mentality, the right expertise. So, formality is as much as I, as a recruiter, love to just get them in and get them through the process. It does need to be a formal process. And it does need to be, when I put somebody in front of a hiring manager, I want to have the confidence that they are evaluating that person based on an equal set of standards, right? Not just winging it. So, and I've been in organizations where there has been no standard, no training. I've been fortunate to be in organizations like Amazon where you don't get to interview until you pass the training. And now my current organization, we just did a company-wide rollout of competency-based hiring. right? So everyone has to take it, and you have to, again, complete that training. So I can see where organizations are moving now more toward a formal type scenario where you have to train someone how to interview. It doesn't come naturally generally, but how do you get the right information then to evaluate them fairly is kind of even the next step, right? The information they give you comes down to the questions you ask, how to be able to evaluate them fairly, and then how to have a group of people evaluate them against the same, the same metric or the same bar. That's been the more significant challenge I've seen over my years.
That's super interesting, Josh. And you talk about people not being trained to do these interviews and more focus on training. And I don't mean to start on a negative note, but I think maybe it helps for us to sort of frame the problems first, and we can talk about strategies that we've seen to help. But interesting, you really made me think, because what I've seen and what we've seen a lot is that great employees are often promoted into more managerial roles, right? And all of a sudden they're responsible for interviewing and for hiring. And unfortunately, while they're great at their job and their skills, and that's why they were promoted, they're often not great interviewers at all. And I'm wondering if you've found that to be the case in some of these organizations where you've worked, and what you've seen regarding some of that.
Oh, yeah. For me specifically, yeah. I mean, your top performer does not always make your best manager. In fact, oftentimes they make your worst manager. And that's okay. Maybe they don't need to be managers. Maybe they just need to be top performers. But to your point, right, you take a more senior person, you promote them into a role, and then there is no training, right? They just start hiring people, and it's like, well, how are you evaluating talent? How are you assessing whether they're competent for the job? How are you assessing whether they're a fit for our culture? So there are a lot of challenges in that scenario. And again, I've been with organizations that do it that way, kind of shotgun and run. And I've been with other organizations that as you get promoted, you go through that training process. So they have to have a level, and you have to pass certification, right? You get a little badge that says you went through this training, and then now you're a certified interviewer. So the better way, the more effective way, the way to get the best results is to have a sort of formal training process to ensure people understand how to interview.
Josh, I'll piggyback off of that and maybe expand slightly. I think it's also really important that we have diverse panels or slates of interviews. 100% agree with the certification process, and that's probably the most rigorous that I've seen certain companies reach that standard for. But I think it's also important that depending on the level that you're trying to bring in, so say, for example, if you're hiring maybe a more early career individual, having a diverse enough panel of both levels and experience within the organization to be able to accurately assess or kind of hone in on that talent bar that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I do find that the best managers or the best people leaders sometimes are so far removed for the work, they may not always understand what an entry level or an early career individual may be doing and what competencies it actually takes to succeed at that level, even with the appropriate training. And so it's really good to have people there who are at a similar position within the company, if that's possible, or at least a similar stage in their career, to say, yeah, this person has the chops, or this person has the competencies required for success in the company and required for success in the particular position that they're applying for.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that moves to how do you solve that problem, right? How do you understand? But yeah, no, I completely agree. It shouldn't just be a bunch of, mid-level managers. You need to have a senior. You need to have a senior staff. You need to have a mid-level staff. Nobody below the position they're interviewing for that level, but certainly somebody who can give a broader view of, their overall attributes, skills, experiences, things of that nature. So yeah, and diversity as well, right? It needs to be diverse from a perspective of, are we bringing the right representation to these panels? Are we bringing the right representation to the interview process? We need to be very thoughtful and very pragmatic with how we construct, the process from start to finish, and who takes part in that process.
So I appreciate, Justin, that you dug into that. And I think, identifying that, finding diverse panels, finding people who understand the job from these different perspectives is a challenge from your perspective. And I'm sure it is from many of our listeners' perspectives. That's a really good point. And I'm wondering, along those lines, what other challenges, what do you find are the biggest interview challenges that face your organizations? Is it what you just mentioned? Is it ensuring that the interview decisions are accurate, that they really do predict job success? Is it that interviews are fair, that everyone's treated the same way, or are there some other dimensions that concern you? And you have an hour to answer that question.
That is definitely a loaded question, Fred. I think from my perspective, fairness and diversity always a top priority. I foresee it being that way far into the future. I think getting great diversity of thought, great diversity of character, and not just culture fit, but culture add. I'm a huge fan of that statement. I've heard it years ago now, and I forget who I could originally attribute that to, but culture add is just an immense value to me anytime I interview. But I think in addition to fairness, I would say that a consistent talent bar is certainly a major focus of every single company that I've been in, ensuring that people know how to properly assess the talent bar and is holding that consistent across all applicants. But then honestly, and this is probably a very rudimentary problem to have, but it's one that I haven't seen solved very well just yet, and it's capacity. As you get into larger and larger organizations, you have tens upon thousands of applicants, and finding enough interviewers to actually interview all those people, even if you have, say, an automated assessment or some other cuts throughout the funnel, it's still a pretty significant challenge, especially as you try to incorporate different types of interviews and try to calibrate interviewers for those different types of interviewers. It's an immense person problem, just in terms of resources and time and investment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Trying to get time sometimes is a challenge, for sure. To go back to, I think the original thought around it all has to be fair. It has to be the same process candidate 1 goes through needs to be the same process candidate 1001 goes through. So process has to be equal. But then to your point, Justin, how are we evaluating the talent, right? There has to be an understanding of how we measure that bar. How are we reaching the level of expertise this person has? That has to be consistent. My version of 3+ years of experience versus your version of 3+ years of experience needs to be similar. It needs to be documented, because if there's equivocation, then that leads to question, and question leads to doubt, doubt leads to before hire. So it's, it needs to be documented, it needs to be written down. That way it's clear as to what that means. But once you get that consistency through the process, you have a consistency of everybody's asking similar, in a similar way, because we're all aiming to hit that particular bar. That's where the quality comes through. And then again, go back to making sure that it's diverse, right? You have to have diversity in that panel, in that process. However, you don't need to overdo it, right? You don't need 17 interviews. You need 3 or 4 max. That's like it. Other organizations, I was with AWS. I mean, they were notorious for 6-7 interviews, and they're hour-long each. I don't think you need all that. I really don't think you need that extensiveness. I think by the time you get to 4, you should have enough data to really make a sound decision. But I've also seen companies do it with 1, and I don't advise that either. You got to hit that middle ground. So anyway, let me meander down that path a little bit, but I think consistency and fairness is the way everything has to start. We have to treat every candidate the same.
Yeah.
So as usual, you guys have just blown my outline. And and you made me think of something, and if I'm thinking of it, perhaps someone in the audience is thinking of it too. And so I'm going to throw my outline away. You talk about capacity, and then you talk about these lengthy interviews, and clearly they're for different stages and different roles. Like, all of those lengthy interviews for higher level roles, I see where there's more value to that. I'm curious though, looking at the top of the funnel for high volume jobs, a really big trend in our field right now is asynchronous recorded interviews. And I'm wondering if you've had experience with them, what you might think about them, maybe what you feel works and what doesn't work with regards to asynchronous interviews. I'm hoping that's going to strike a chord for some of our listeners.
Josh, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I've had experience with that, and I've had, and when I was in RPO, we had clients that had higher volumes, and certainly to manage the volume of applicants, right, there need to be an automated type solution. I think I don't know if it's the best answer that we'll ever come to, but it was at least a reasonably quality answer for what we were trying to accomplish. My only concern is it can interject bias way too early in the process when it is video, right? Because you immediately start to evaluate them based on how they look. I have some questions around that. However, by and large, we found it to be a reasonably productive tool, and the hiring managers and the hiring teams were reasonably happy with the performance of it. So, until a better solution comes along, I think it's definitely a credible conversation starter. And depending on your environment and the amount of volume that you have, it could be a really good option. As you pointed out, high volume. So we're talking entry level, early career type individuals. And then the roles that we had at the time, it did produce faster and better results than what we could do with a team of recruiters trying to do the same. So, all in all, it was a good experience. Again, just had some concerns around introducing bias way early, in my opinion. But that didn't seem to necessarily shake out in the details, so to speak. So, again, that was what I've done with it.
Josh, I'll plus one you, but then also add that I think there are instances where, just like any tool, there's going to be trade-offs. In this particular example, though, what I found is one of the most impactful things for an asynchronous one-way interview is the opportunity to open the funnel to more people. So I think of some positions like, say, call center roles or other positions where individuals may not be able to take time away from their normal job, assuming they have a job as they're interviewing, and that already precludes them from the process. So it just excludes them immediately. Whereas with an asynchronous interview platform, they can record their interview 7 or 8 o'clock at night, or maybe if they have children, after their children go to bed, and then a recruiter can pick that up sometime the next day and review it at their leisure as well. So I think there is definitely the potential there to use these tools to open the funnel up more and wider to different types of people who might have just historically been excluded. But I agree with you. I think it'll be interesting to see the research in, say, 5 years, or even 3 years from now, on the different types of cues people exhibit over, say, Zoom and other platforms compared to being in person, and how much we can pick up on that information as humans, and how much that actually influences our conscious, unconscious biases and our hiring decisions. So I'm really curious to see where that body of research will go. I know there's already been some little snippets of research coming out already, but I think we're still very early on and still young and nascent in our understanding of like how much bias is actually there.
Mm-hmm.
That's super interesting, and you're absolutely right, Justin. That research is going on. I mean, everyone is now looking at all of those spatial features, looking at speech, looking at psycholinguistics, looking at all of those things, and can also compare that to gender and ethnicity and other demographics over tens of thousands of interviews. So we are going to see some really cool things about what's actually happening and what are the interactions and what are the results, and really cool to watch that. And it's interesting because I agree, Josh, there are clearly drawbacks, right? But I think your point that they can save time, and also the other point that they can really create inclusivity are a couple of positive points. So maybe some useful information for our listeners out there to consider if they're thinking about bringing in a tool like asynchronous recorded interviews. One of the other things.
Just one more thing to add: the benefits for high volume recruiting outweigh the possible detractors, right? I mean, so if I were in a situation where I was looking at that tool in a high volume situation, I would absolutely consider it and absolutely lean into something like that, because right now the detraction or the negative potential impact is so small that it's manageable. Right. So let me just be clear, it's definitely manageable. And I would definitely lean into a tool like that for high volume situations. So anyway, sorry, didn't interrupt, but just want to add that on there.
Interrupt anytime. Interestingly, and I'm not going to get into a marketing or sales presentation, but there's also more going on now with asynchronous interviews, because certain companies are now using psycholinguistics. So not only can you find out the question, responses to those questions, like Justin says, your hiring manager goes in tomorrow to look at the interview and can learn about the candidate and and hear the direct responses to the questions posed, but there's also a whole nother additional layer of information that is able to be provided in some cases based on psycholinguistics. So we can actually look at behavioral tendencies and get some competency information that the candidate isn't even aware of or isn't trying to be giving socially desirable answers, things like that. So I agree, going to be really cool to watch the future and see what, how much data we can actually glean from these types of interviews and what we can do with it. But yeah, really cool. Another thing someone said, at this point I forgot who it was, I think it was Joshua, talking about formal training, and it made me think about it. And of course, I'm such a testing guy, I apologize. I go back to structured interviews, and I think about the fact that the formal training, from what I've seen, always tends to be about the questions. What questions am I asking? How are they related to the role? Are they job related? Am I asking about the right competencies? Am I rating them properly? Which, of course, the interviewers should be trained on asking the right questions and using the right rating scales, clearly. But one of the things that I'm very aware of, and we've seen a lot, is that the structure of the interview itself, the framework, doesn't always exist. And I think interviewers are sort of all over the place. And I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of training, to follow an interview framework as opposed to, or in conjunction with, training on the topics and the ratings themselves, or what your thoughts are about that.
Josh, maybe I could kick us off. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, Fred, I think you asked a really great question, and one that I think I've seen it handled different ways to varying levels of success, honestly, across many different companies. Some small companies doing this very well, some larger companies doing this equally as well. What I will say is I think the more structure you can put up front, and so what I mean by that is a pretty rigorous certification or calibration process, very clearly outlining expectations and outlining the deviations where they may exist. Maybe, for example, one job family receives a slightly different interview structure, interview format, and how candidates flow between the interviews, I think is very important. Just as critical as the training to ask the questions themselves, to be quite honest with you. Josh actually mentioned consistency earlier, and I think that is the most important attribute here, is just driving consistency across the entire process. And so the more structures, the more frameworks that you can put in place, and the higher that you hold the standard of your own employees to, so those people either training to become interviewers or who are already interviewers and have to have maybe some sort of consistent or ongoing training and education to maintain that certification, I think is very important. The only other thing that I'll add here is I think the rubric is going to be your best friend. And the rubric will be ideally different depending on the job family, what have you. But I think that when you talk about frameworks and you talk about consistency and ensuring that every interviewer is evaluating the talent bar the exact same way and driving consistency and fairness in the process, having a rubric that very clearly spells out, here is what, so I'll just use the example of 1 to 5 scale. Here's what a 1 is in terms of concrete behaviors, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, and so that there's very little subjective and personal interpretation, I think the better. And that's really the capstone to the framework, I personally think, for a consistent and fair process.
Yeah, +1, certainly on all of that. And I think what we also need to factor into that conversation, like Fred was alluding to, was you got to be there's a personal side of this, right? Why am I at this company? Why am I here? Why am I recruiting for this role? What is it I'm excited about? Why do I enjoy the work that I do? And I think that falls into that structure, right? And you want an interview to be a conversation. You don't want it to be so mechanical that it's uncomfortable. And we've all been in those. When I think about the way I typically will ask that interviews be structured or guide, right? First 5 minutes is introductions. Your next 40 minutes is me as the interviewer asking the interviewee questions. right? The last 15, I will pause. I will put my pen and paper down. I'll stop typing and I'll allow any question they want to ask. And I set that expectation up front, right? So I say, hey, this is how this hour is going to go. This is what you can expect. I put them at ease immediately so they know what they're going to do. They know what they're walking into. And I think as long as that type of structure is trained and done in a consistent way, they get that experience from me to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, right? I have the opportunity to tell them why I love this job, or I work this company, or all the things I'm doing, all the exciting things and information. But I also get a lot of information I need from them. And all of that is then backed by your rubric, which is what you just mentioned on that rating scale, right? How do they answer the questions that I have? How are they, how are their answers? Were they average? Were they bar raising? Were they below average? Taking all that information back in, and you're using that to assess in a fair and equitable way across the interview team, because you're all looking at the same target. You're all basing it on the same information and the same expectations. So yes, we absolutely need to have process. We absolutely need to have a structured way to gather, collate, and refine information. We also got to make sure it's still human. We got to still make sure there's a conversation in there, because it ultimately, at the end of the day, it's me talking to you, you talking to me.
Super interesting. I hope I didn't cut you off, Justin. You talk about the personal side of the interview and the interaction, and it makes me think of a couple of things. One, I don't think, from my perspective, that takes away from the framework. I think that needs to be built into the framework, and I think that's something interviewers are often not trained on. Even in some really good interviewer training programs, I think that's an area that's missed. And one reason I mention that is because Justin talks about the behaviorally anchored rating scales, which I agree. If we're going to have valid ratings, we need anchored scales, and we need to teach people how to use them. And I'm wondering if there's a blend there. If creating the more personal side doesn't, in fact, open up the candidate to providing you with more job-relevant information to make more accurate ratings. So I'm wondering, does that make sense? And I'm wondering what you might think about that.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I 100% agree with Josh that the personal aspect should not be lost. The thing that I would hate to have happen in an interview is it feel very transactional. I'm looking for a job. I'm in this job or in a job. I'm going to talk to you about it for 45 minutes to an hour. That doesn't instill a lot of confidence. And I feel like, at least today, it's a two-way street. The candidate needs to evaluate the company just as much as the company needs to evaluate the candidate. And that personal side, I think, is very important to at least establishing trust early, that this can be a two-way equitable conversation between two people who hopefully want to work together in the future. And if not, that's fine. That outcome is totally fine to have. I think what is also really important is, as we think about that personal aspect, sometimes people, and this is maybe where the bias creeps in, will ground themselves a little too much in their personal reality and forget that everyone else is different. So, I love coffee. I'm a huge coffee nerd. I have coffee paraphernalia all around my place. And I generally tell that to applicants or candidates. I'm like, yeah, I love coffee. But if they come back and say they absolutely hate coffee, that does not make me, I hope anyway, think of them any less. And it's just really important to kind of call that out to interviewers, is that as you do inject a little bit of that humanity into your interviews, that people be aware that not everyone's like you. And that's actually what makes the world interesting and fun.
Yeah, completely agree. It makes me think, it goes back, people buy from who they like, right? People want to work with who they like. And I've had, my career interviews that have been stone cold, and you get off phone and that was a waste of time. I would never work. If that's the people, I would never work there. Conversely, I've had conversations where I was like, I would take a pay cut to work there because of their energy and their excitement and their passion for that role and that job, and that company was amazing. So I think there's, but again, it's all wrapped in the person, anchored by process, right? Anchored by a specific, pragmatic, thoughtful way to conduct an interview to get information. but also still being that person and still having that conversation with them.
So that clearly answers my question of, do you think it's important for the interviewer to sell the candidate on the organization?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm wondering, you know, at what point are you going too far? And also for a real frontline role, you know, someone's working in a warehouse, or you know, it's a frontline sales role, or just any sort of frontline top of the funnel role. How do we sell the candidate on both the organization and the importance of that job to the overall success of the business? I mean, are there any tips or thoughts you've had, or anything you could share along those lines?
I'll jump in. I think people want to know what's in it for them, right? They want to earn a paycheck. Yes, that's a given. Yes, they want to earn income, but they also want to know what's in it for them. To your point, Fred, if you work with an organization, and I'll use Chewy, for example, right? And I'm not saying pro Chewy, not Chewy. I'm just giving kind of an example, but because my dog just barked at the door. But if I'm going to work for Chewy and I'm going to go work as a customer or call service representative, right? I know, and I would want to know that the people I'm helping have pets. They love pets. So if you're going to come to work at Chewy, you need to have a passion for pets. And you're going to help those who have the pets. But then, so first thing would be relative information, right? What's relative to me? The second thing to me would be, where can I go with this experience? Where else can I grow? What else can I learn? How can I expand my experience, my portfolio of skills as I continue to go through my career? Because to your point, if we're talking about early career individuals, right, how do we engage them in a way? And it made me think back to, using the asynchronic interview phase, right? So you load that with a 15 or 30-second interview or a video of someone saying, hey, thank you for coming to us. This is why we're so excited you're here. This is what you could expect from the role. This is how people in this role have excelled their careers. This is the impact you're making to our customers, right? You can give them information, even in a high volume scenario. Now, it's not as personal as a one-on-one conversation, but at least they're still getting a bulk of that information. And I do think that people do need to understand how they impact the organization, what this role really means, and what value they could potentially bring into the organization. So I think it goes all the way around from, entry level to executive level.
The only thing I'll add, because Josh said it beautifully, is I think it's also very important in the selling process to be realistic. I think people can smell BS from a mile away, and people are not stupid. I've seen, especially companies who may be desperate for really great talent, almost oversell to the point where it does feel a little fake, and you start wondering, well, what's behind the veil? It sounds too good to be true. And so I think just honesty is a really good policy to have here. And every job, every organization is going to have its wonderful moments, its wonderful people, but there's also going to be the balance of, you might have to get in the trenches sometime. You might have to roll up your sleeves. You might have to do X, Y, and Z. And just communicating that to the candidate, especially if they don't ask, I think having that upfront, unprompted discussion can be really meaningful to candidates. And again, establish that trust that we talked about earlier in the interviewing process. And so I think it's just having that balanced perspective is really important to then take to the candidate so that they can consider all options. And hopefully they're doing the exact same with you as well.
Shifting gears a little bit, and thank you for that, both of you. Quite often, TA professionals, hiring managers, they have not only the interviews, but they have results from assessments on the candidates. So they may have cognitive scores, they may have skill scores, they may have scores on behavioral tendencies, personality traits, motivation, attitude, all of those great things that we have tests for. And I've heard debate, actually, some folks saying, hey, I don't want to look at those before I interview someone because I don't want to be biased in my thinking about this candidate. I want to see a blank slate when I talk to this person, where I have heard others say, no, I want all the information up front before I talk to someone, and it's going to help guide my interview. What are your thoughts on that?
Justin, I'll let you go first.
I'm smiling because I had a very similar conversation not too long ago. Fred, that's a wonderful question. And I think this may be a case, at least in my experience, where there is no right or wrong answer. I'm going to use the cop-out of it depends. So please forgive me up front. I'll try to qualify and clarify where I can. I think oftentimes we as practitioners and our partners throughout business always want as much information as possible from candidates. That's an admirable goal. I think sometimes we can also over assess. And where I think the danger in that lies is let's just use software engineering, for example. We have software engineers or coders coming in, and we may have an automated assessment for them and set the bar really, really high. But the question that we have to ask ourselves, and I think this is where we as IO practitioners can really add value and force people to really think through what is the actual problem here and what are we trying to solve for, is do they really need that high of a score to begin an entry-level coding job at XYZ company? So if they don't pass that, but if they maybe get a more average score, is that still okay? And if you don't have that information up front, is it going to change the way that you interview or interact with a candidate in any way, especially if you have other, say, more technical interviews built into the process? So you're still getting some kind of a read on their technical coding ability. I think where it can be really helpful is, as you mentioned, to guide some parts of the interview. I will caution there, though, is that if you have a structured interview, you want to really be intentional about how you build in the assessments to those structured pieces. And so you want to ensure that the people giving those very specific types of interviews are calibrated or certified on the assessment if that's possible, and at least understand what it is they're asking about, what the responses they're looking for are, and how to grade or score that appropriately. I worry about just giving anyone access to assessment scores and expecting them to understand how to interpret it appropriately.
Yes to all of that. And what's interesting is even somebody in the chat said something about how about assessments like DISC or Myers-Briggs, and what I would say is what I've told many a leader in my time, which is it's an assessment. It's not a decision tool. It's one piece of information that you use in the culmination of determining whether to hire someone, but you do not base your decision based on that assessment. I can think of one very large global organization that if you didn't score the right, Myers-Briggs, you were done. They would it's like, this is totally the wrong way to do it. Because to Justin's point, not only were they making assumptions, they weren't necessarily trained on how to really interpret the data. They were just being told. So I don't have any issues with assessments, but I think there's a place and a time for them. And I think it's one piece of the puzzle. And that's a great example that you use as far as software developers, right? Every company out there wants that guy that can just knock the socks off coding, but they have no experience. It's like, well, are you hiring for potential or are you hiring for skill? Because if you're hiring for potential, then the assessment really is just a guide to tell us where they may be. But if you're hiring for experience, then that assessment can be more indicative of where they are in their experience. So you got to be very careful. But I think that anytime you can garner information around a candidate and how they think, how they work, how they tend to be, it's always good. But it's an assessment. It's not a decision tool. Because again, back to what Justin said earlier, we want diversity of thought on our teams. We don't want to all think the same. And if I have a bunch of INFPs running around, we're not going to be a very good team. And I'm no offense to any INFPs out there. I'm just making the point of, if there's 5 of us and we're all on the same team, we all have the same categorization, what good are we, right? We need to have diversity of thought. So I will always go back to, hey, put the assessments, be thoughtful, don't over-assess, but then recognize that it's an assessment. It's one piece of the puzzle. It's not a decision tool. And I think a lot of organizations just look at these assessments like, oh, it's a decision tool. It's like, yeah, you're using it the complete wrong way. And empirically, we can show you with data that you're using it the wrong way. This is not what it was intended for. So that's I'm very passionate about assessments. I've had a few clients that were just all in on assessments. And again, I don't have any issues with them when they're being used efficiently and effectively in the right way. And the people who are reading the scores are accurately trained to understand what they're reading. And oftentimes they were not.
I think you're spot on. And I'm a testing guy, so I doubt there's anyone out there in our audience that believes more in testing than I do. But I also believe that you have to understand what those scores mean, what they are and are not predictive of. And I worry that people over-rely on some assessments and under-rely on others. So really, really good points on understanding what am I using here. You know, this company is selling me this assessment. It's everywhere. It's all around the world. It's a great test. Well, you know, it may be a great test for some things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to predict who's going to be good in this role. So really, really good point for you. And I think it also, for me, sort of shows the bifurcation between these two very much assessments, right? Psychometric assessments and an interview. They're both assessments, but they're doing very different kinds of things. And cool that we're talking about interviews, but I'm actually excited, and maybe we can get Josh Jones to let us do a webinar about, you know, psychometric assessments. I think it'd be really fun. We would have a good time with that. But anyway, I'm sorry, I digress. Really appreciate everything you're saying. I have a question. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about bias, because obviously that's a huge issue. It's important to all of us. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm going to take the stance that most interviewers are well-intentioned, because they are, I believe. But they're human, right? And we all have unconscious bias. And I'm wondering what we can do to help interviewers avoid letting unconscious bias creep into their interviews. What's worked for you in the past?
Justin, you want to take a shot?
I can kick us off. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do this full justice, but I think so many organizations that I've been a part of fail to acknowledge even the foundation of just something as simple as bias training, unconscious or subconscious bias training. I think just having that, at least as an entry point, can do volumes as you think about explaining things like the similarity effect or halo and horns effect, so on and so forth. But all too often, you have people who might even be interviewing for the first time and don't understand that if a candidate, I'll use my coffee example earlier, if a candidate says, hey, Justin, I love coffee, that's likely to increase your positive perception of them. And it's likely, if you like coffee, I'll clarify, if you like coffee, but that's likely to increase your positive perception of them and start to kick off some of those unconscious biases. And so I think just having that foundational training is really important. The second piece I'll anchor on is having training around note-taking and the importance of not making a rating or decision immediately. I do think that it is critical to take really good notes, to very objectively describe or almost mimic, if you can, the way that a candidate is responding to your interview questions and how they're performing on the interview. And then leave it sit for an hour, at least an hour, and come back to it. Reread your notes and try to distance yourself from the more human side of that interview as you think about all of the fun stuff that you talked about, for example, or the connection that you try to make to the candidate, and just think objectively, for the role that I'm hiring for the company and the culture here, how do they fit in and as objective as possible while keeping those biases in mind? So, Josh, I'm sure you have much better strategies, but I'll just lay the foundation out there as well.
No, I think that was great. You know, I was just sitting here thinking, and you know, I said how many years I've been in this business, and Fred deferred not to, but you know, not that long ago, this was not a conversation. This was not a topic conversation, right? So people that are more senior like myself in the industry, 10 years ago, we weren't having these conversations. 15 years ago, we were. Well, maybe 10 years ago, we were just starting, but 15 years ago, we're not. So when you think about the concept of people that are in my age bracket are now the leaders or senior leaders of organizations, meaning that we weren't raised with what bias is. We had to be taught what it was. And then once we understood, it's like, oh, the light went off. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I was doing that. So going back to Justin's point, you have to have a clear and concise training program to help them understand and identify their own biases, conscious or unconscious, and how to eradicate as much as they could them from a potential interview process. And I think that's where it starts. That's the fundamental beginning of really how to make sure that is a fair and equitable conversation for everyone throughout that process. The other thing that I would add to your point, Justin, is note-taking, right? I mean, again, I go back to my most recent organization, and they give us a training on how to take notes during an interview, right? It's like it's part of that training program to become an interviewer. It's like you have to be able to take good notes, because you then have to take those notes and put those into a system which is then categorized and reviewed by everybody on the interview team, right? So you're sharing your notes with everybody, and they can read your notes and your thoughts and your feedback. And that certainly is a very critical component of it, but it all goes back to training. It all goes back to how to identify it, how to make sure that you're aware of it when it happens. So that's where it all begins. And as you start to train and you go through organizations and you have your leaders become better understanding of what it means, then and only then will they start to really identify in their own environments where they're doing it and be able to remove that and have a generally open, good, solid conversation is the idea.
I need another hour, but you talked about something. Your note-taking discussion really triggers something for me, and that's about panel interviews and consensus ratings. And that's a huge topic. I recently did some, expert witness and testimony about consensus ratings, and it's really important. And, I guess my question is, when you have a panel of interviewers, a panel of raters, so say, Josh, you did the interview and it's recorded, but now it's going to a panel, and it's me and Justin are the other raters. What do you think is appropriate in terms of, is it okay if we all have different opinions of this person? Should we be within 2 points on a 10-point scale or 1 point on a 5-point scale? If we're not, do we need to talk as a group and look at your notes and our notes and see where do we differ and come to some consensus or agreement as to within a point or so? Of course, we're going to let our own individual differences impact the ratings as they should, but how much are we going to allow that? So I guess does the topic of consensus rating make sense and come into play when we're looking at these panel interviews?
I'll jump in. So if I'm thinking of when you say panel interview, just make sure I understand. So I'm an individual, but I'm interviewing with 4 different people at the same time, right? That's okay. I haven't had a lot of those throughout my career. And it's not necessarily something that we used a lot of or that we suggest. Now, there are times to where, you may have 1 or 2. We certainly strive to not have more than 2 or 3 on a panel, because then you're just blitzkrieging the poor person, and it's just not going to end well. But to your point, if they're all well trained and if they're all as an understanding of what bar we are trying to evaluate them against, and it's clear and it's written and it's understood, then you should not have wild variances in the scores from the panel. Where you will find wild variances is when you're all measuring against a different bar in your head, and there's no consistency with how you're evaluating this person. So I think it's as long as it's a structured process and you're all evaluating against it, a set, set targets, great. Those would be fine. And if for some reason you had an outlier, then that's a one-off conversation to understand more about why that person felt that way.
And I think that can come back to your note-taking, right? Well, here's why I felt that way. Oh, I didn't catch that. I was looking at my phone. Didn't hear that piece of information or whatever. And I think that's where it made a lot of sense to me when you started talking about the note-taking.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in individual interviews, the way that Amazon does it is you spend, an hour with each person, right? They're all taking notes, then you come back and you compare those. But even just a difference in those notes, there were many conversations around, hey, we're measuring to this bar, but you seem to be not measuring to that bar, or you weren't given the right information. Where walk us through what you were thinking, walk us through what the situation was, right? Why is that such an outlier versus the rest? So all that to wrap it in to say, I'm never a big fan of big panel interviews, but if they have to exist, then everyone needs to be trained in understanding, right? What bar are we measuring this person against? And we all have a clear understanding of that.
Yeah. I think that's where the rubric will be your best friend as well. I know I've said that before, just to reuse the tagline, is again, just making sure that people are interpreting and translating things correctly and holding everyone to that equal bar. The only thing that I'll add here, and Fred, you might have actually been going here already, is that I think that works for when the interviews are either the same, so you have multiple types of a single interview, or you have multiple people doing a single interview. I think that it should be expected and encouraged whenever you have multiple different types of interviews and everybody's on a single panel, that people bring their true experiences. And I don't want to say defend their ratings, because that may sound a little too mechanical, but it can stand behind and justify the ratings, because each person is going to bring a very unique perspective from the information that they gleaned only from that particular interview type. So if you have like a behavioral interview, a more technical interview, and one around job fit, for example, those scores could potentially wildly differ, and that's okay. But you need to be able to have the mechanisms and structure in place for the interviewers to then explain why their rating is what it is, and ground everyone that I can see how you arrived at that conclusion, even if I didn't sit on that interview with you.
I agree with you, and I think it's okay to say defend your ratings. I'm a big fan of defending your ratings.
Sure.
We don't have much time left, so I just kind of wanted to wrap up with something. And I saw in the chat someone was saying, "Oh, this is awesome," some to the effect of, but how do I develop an interviewer training program? And I'm sure people, a lot of people don't have the resources to do that or know where to start. And so it makes me think of two things. One, we talked about this structure. So clearly there is a structure. There are things we're looking at. How is the greeting of the candidates? Did I sell the position? And then when I go in, did I cover the topics properly? Did I rate based on behaviorally anchored ratings? Was it a conversation, not an interrogation? Did I wrap up? Did I ask them if they had questions? Did I answer their questions? Did I tell them what the next steps are going to be? So clearly there's a framework that should be followed, and there's lots of detail within. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, now we have technology, right? We have AI, which has the capability of looking at every one of those conversations, and also looking at groups of conversations as a whole. And I'm wondering because this is something that we've put together now that we think is going to be really useful. And in fact, we won the HR Tech Innovative Product of the Year award this year for this. And it's a product called Interview Intelligence, Interview Insights, that watches the entire interview, and then at the end coaches the interviewer and says, hey, your introduction, you didn't do this, and this is why that's not a great thing, and you didn't make this candidate feel welcome, and here's why it's important to do that, or you didn't cover these topics, et cetera. And I'm wondering, I guess, does that sound like something that could be useful in industry? Not whether it's us, but I think this is where technology is going, right? I mean, we're being watched. Computers can look at all this information. There's just metadata being used. We can look at interviewers over thousands of interviews within lines of business. We can look at interactions between different demographics. What are your thoughts about that technology? Besides being scared by it.
Yeah. I'll jump in. I think there's, I have two thoughts, right? Let's not over technology embed. Let's not over, how do I want to say this? Let's not embed too much technology in a process that involves humans. However, having said that, I also think there is value you can glean from that information. Now, would I want to be personally told that, the machine was watching, right? And I didn't do this, and this? No. Would I want to understand from the last 100 interviews that 82% of the time we didn't discuss as a group, right? That we missed selling the organization or talking about the benefits. That I think is a little bit different way. I don't know if I would personally want that to come right from a very personal perspective. Maybe it is a good coaching opportunity, but I don't think there's relevance in that, because to that point, if you show patterns to where 82% of the time, making this number up, that you missed that particular part, that does impact. The other thing that I would add to this, and I was going to go back a few minutes ago, oftentimes, and this is a mindset change, and I know we're right here at time, and I'll wrap it up with this, is that most often we look for reasons not to hire. And that's the wrong mindset. We need to be looking for reasons to hire, right? What's encouraging about that candidate? But I talk to hiring managers and leaders and talent acquisition, that they're all focused on, well, we're looking for the reasons not to hire. And it's like, but you're thinking about this the wrong way. So I just implore everybody on this call, when you think about your hiring process, you're looking for reasons to hire people, not to rule them out. That's not why we're here. Yeah. Sorry. But, hey, more AI, I'm open to it. Bring it on. Cool.
Yeah. I think we as people have a fear of the unknown. So the only thing that I'll add to that, Josh, and beautifully said, is I think the more we can demystify that, and the more we can show what is being considered, why it's being considered, and why it's important, the more willing people will be to accept feedback and accept data from solutions like artificial intelligence and machine learning. But if it's just a black box that people can't understand, I think people are inherently skeptical, and rightfully so.
Plus 1,000. I eloquently said. Thank you.
Are you going to yank us off the air now, Josh?
This is such a great group. Every time I'm around you guys, I learn something. So I really appreciate the fact that Justin and Josh, especially, that you were willing to come back and join Dr. Rafilson and I and continue this conversation that we started a few weeks or a couple of months ago. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation again. We should probably do this at a steady cadence because the conversations are awesome. Big thanks to our friends over at Talview for helping us put this on. Big thanks to everybody out there in the audience that tuned in. If you have a desire to get involved with our programming, please let me know, either by recommending topics, or if you'd like to join us on some of these conversations. Let's talk through that. And without any further ado, I knew we were going to hit time, so I know we've gone over. So I'm going to let everybody go. But until next time, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you real soon.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Take care.